Welcome to our IAS President's Lecture of 2023. I'm Christine Hastorf, the newly confirmed president of the IAS, and I'm here today to welcome and honor our past president who's going to be speaking today. I want to thank everyone for coming to the presentation. It is being recorded up until the questions, which will occur afterwards. If you need to get any language support, please, we're going to do this informally here. So please write something in the chat and one of our stalwart helpers in the translation committee will be there to help you. And also, if there's anything else you need to communicate with. If you want to communicate with an IAS volunteer, you can send a private message also in the chat. As I said, there'll be a chance for questions at the end of this wonderful presentation. But it's just a great pleasure and very exciting to welcome and present John Rick to speak to us today in the presidential lecture, his presidential lecture. John Rick is a professor emeritus of anthropology and the former chair of the Department of Anthropological Sciences at Stanford University, as well as the past director of Stanford's Archaeological Center. He earned his BA from the University of California, Santa Cruz, go banana slugs, and his MA and PhD from the University of Michigan. I don't know what their mascot is. His teaching concentrates on South American archaeology and the beginnings of socio-political complexity, as we will experience today. Hunters and gatherers also, stone tools, and digital methodologies in archaeology. Also, we'll get some of that today. For the last 28 years, he has directed a large field project at Chavin de Huantar, a monumental World Heritage Site dating to around 1000 BCE, but I'm sure he'll clarify the range of dates today. This is in the central highlands of Peru. And there, he and his team has been able to uncover incredible things, building on the illustrious people who'd worked there before, of course. But the most recent work at the site consists of extensive excavations, reinterpreting the long-term design, construction, and use of ritual spaces, sort of illustrated here in his beginning slide, along with research into long-term conservation methodologies of this monument. A previous long-term project focused on early hunting and gathering in the high altiplano, Puna of Peru, that he really started his career on, which is when I got to know him, which is a real treat to think of, again, all of his lovely caves. But he's also worked in the American Southwest and also in the Guatemalan highlands. So he is really an American archaeologist. So I'd like to turn over the podium now, if you will, to John, who will speak on titled Conclusions from Chavin de Huantar, 30 Years of Lessons from a Secretive Site. So we're all looking forward to this, John, and thank you so much.
Great. Well, thank you, Christine, for that introduction. I hope I can meet my own expectations as well as yours. Indeed, Christine hit almost all my major points. 28 years of work here. It's got to mean something. It's got to do something. It's got to take us somewhere. And I keep jumping in the car and trying to start the motor, and it seems to go along the same route most of the times, but I'm going to try to push that a little bit. I do want to give a sense of what a site can teach you. And obviously by the site, I refer to not only the site, but the community, the temporal context, the local environment, all sorts of things that affect us as archaeologists. I originally put in I think the subtitle was Lessons from a Stern Master or from the Great Master. And I was advised that it might be mistaken as me talking about myself, which it certainly wouldn't be. I feel like many ways like a child who's getting boxed on the ears by an archaeological site. Across the decades, every time I start to gain some confidence and think I really know what I'm seeing, see patterns, think I've identified, for instance, the range of material culture in the site in the Chavin period. And I've missed big blocks of technology and production, whole types and classes of artifacts that I'd never seen before, because I've excavated in a slightly different area. So it is a secretive site, and I think that it doesn't give up its secrets easily, and I don't think it was meant to. The bottom line message I'm going to really try to give you is that doing archaeology in Chavin, even visiting the site, we're still getting messages from the people who designed it. We're still getting an impression of what they wanted us to get out of the site or not get out of it. It wasn't a site that was meant to speak in a loud voice, except at certain moments to certain people in certain contexts within the site. So I'm going to try to rip through all that type of stuff. At the same time, I do want to start out with enough information that if there are people here in our expanding clientele of the IAS, the people who are members or are contemplating becoming members, or just wonder whether this could be an organization for them, I don't want to lose them right away by hitting high archaeological points without at least situating ourselves. So let's get underway, or this is going to take entirely too long. Okay, first one is, so Chavin de Huántar, the highlands of Ancash, the Callejon of Conchucos, is a site that has been known for a long time, and it has a certain level of fame for what it has within it, what it stands for. Probably the first thing that really grabbed people was Chavin art. It's iconic, apocryphally, supposedly influenced Picasso. As far as I can tell, it's not true, but it could have. It is a definite style. It has certain lexical parameters that make it easily identifiable. And in fact, something that I will emphasize later, it's actually not that hard to separate Chavin's style from the style of any other contemporary site in the Andes. Sort of done by feel, perhaps, but I think I can do it. And I think that's intentional. I think it was meant to be separable. So Chavin got a lot of fame for that. We had an early identification of the gallery system, and I'm going to be spending quite a bit of time on that. These underground passageways, stone-lined, quite often labyrinthine, in great multiplicity. They were fascinating to me. They were fascinating to travelers. It just got people going. I remember when I first learned about Chavin, the site just pulled me in. To locate ourselves in time, I would look at something like this. I don't think we need too much more than that. Middle and late formative. The site it has radiocarbon dates going back to 1300 BC. I'll explain later why we don't know as much about early Chavin as we'd like to. But it's sitting right there in what I much prefer to call the formative period. It is a time of things forming up, a time in which characteristics which will be built into those boring states are coming into existence. They don't come out of nowhere. They wouldn't have been accepted out of nowhere. They had to come in through some sort of a strategic manipulation of culture. That's my position. This stuff just doesn't happen at everybody's behest. Chavin today is quite important. When you get on both the coins and on the 50 Sole bill, you know you're somewhere. It is lots of recognition in terms of the World Heritage status. And I want to say from the very start that it's been an incredible privilege to work thus far. And believe me, I'm not leaving Chavin. I'm not dead yet. And so but the country of Peru, for whatever reasons, and I've tried hard to make those reasons correct, trusted me to work in this site. And that's a pretty amazing thing. I honestly never expected that. Even after I had started working there, I always thought my next request would be turned down, and it never was. And so I'm trying my best to compensate the country in various ways. I got the very wonderful notice a couple of weeks ago that my library is on in Aduana in Callao. It will be on its way to the new National Museum to join Lumbreras as a library there as a donation. And I'm most pleased that those books can be made use of. But at any rate, Chavin has gotten into the public vision from my time in first days in archaeology in Peru. Here is a comic book on the case of the giants. Quite obviously rather fantasy-laden story coming out of some actually archaeologists declaring that there were giants buried at Chavin. So it's gotten into the national attention in various ways. But here's the site itself. We're lying to the east of the Cordillera Blanca, which you see in the distance, the White Mountains, which run along the east side of the Callejón de Huaylas. But we're looking down into the river valley, which forms the Callejón of Conchucos, the valley of those with hats. And up until quite recently, this was a place where every man, once he's of reasonable age, would have worn a hat, and most of the women too. But for men, it was absolutely mandatory. Take a look at some of the photos of Teo's early presence in Chavin, and you will not see an adult man without a hat. At any rate, this river valley flowing north to the Amazon, it's kind of like saying west to Alaska, going west. What? Well, these drainages do not flow to the east, they flow to the north. And in fact, if you want to follow drainages to the north to get yourself down into the Amazon, you will go 1,000 kilometers out of your way. If you go due east, you're going to have a bunch of mountains to cross. So the strategic point halfway between the Amazon and the coast, well, maybe so, but not necessarily on a terribly direct route. The little town of Chavin is pretty easily visible in the lower part of the photograph. To its immediate left, little tan patch is the monument of Chavin itself. Flowing towards it is the Huachexa River, coming from the distance, flowing out of the foothills of the Cordillera Blanca. And you have the Mosna River, now called the Mosna, flowing from left to right, going north. Now, some of the things that Chavin is, I would maybe go back to this and say, Chavin is really a very Andean place. It's highly mountainous. It is remote, although you can get there fairly easily today, depending on the state of the asphalted, alternating with bad gravel road, just depending on how much the asphalt has decayed. It still has a feeling when you pass through the kilometer-long tunnel, which actually pierces the Cordillera Blanca. You definitely get the feeling that you're passing into a different world. And I think that's really very much the case. When you get there, you find yourself in a real Andean town. Now, by real Andean, I'm not trying to say unspoiled, you know, the true Andean. Well, there is no true Andean. We're talking about a culture that's as obviously in as much change as anybody is these days. But there is lots of traditions still here, and lots of characteristics of the town reflect those that are broadly, I think, experienceable as one travels through the Andes. A quite small population, a not terribly easygoing population. They don't quite often get along very well between well-defined classes of people. It's an interesting, quite often welcoming, very rich world that is feeling many of the same strains that people all over the world are. They're hardly isolated. Chavin has been very aware of their heritage, the site. This is a shot taken about 20 years ago when people in Chavin were still weaving actively with these traditional Chavin designs. And by that, I don't mean prehistoric. I don't mean archaeological designs. These are reinterpreted designs, many of them present in some form. But those blankets you see in the background are gone now. They no longer are being woven in Chavin whatsoever, whereas the stone carving in the foreground is. And I've seen some of the more iconic art discoveries that we've made transformed into stone fairly soon after they were found. And that's just more than wonderful. But the people themselves have a possessive feeling about the site. They've often resented the fact that the Peruvian government administrates it. And they feel that that should be their right and that all income from the site should be going to them. I'm going to take sides on any of those issues, but it is very much the case that the town identifies with the site. Now, Chavin is historic, whether it's Cieza de Leon or Mogrovejo. Early travelers were aware of Chavin, even if they didn't get there. It's reported in many cases, and there's enough description to suggest that even by the later 1600s, maybe even the early 1600s, the galleries of Chavin were acknowledged. And there seems to be a casual reference to the Lanzón sculpture going on. So the main thing is Chavin was never not there. Since it was built, it has been continuously known and continuously visited for all sorts of reasons. It is a historical place. Raimondi visited it. He drew the Lanzón sculpture, and of course, he didn't do the final drawing we see, but his notes were the source of it. And it doesn't look exactly like it, but it gets us there. Shortly after Raimondi was there, it looks like other historic things happened in Chavin, and I'll just mention this in passing. This is a small part of some 55 human burials of historic age that we encountered digging in Chavin in one fairly well-defined sector. For various circumstantial reasons, we think these are associated with the War of the Pacific. And indeed, in 1882, the Chilean army came through Chavin, following Cáceres and his army as they were heading north towards Huamachuco. Again, we think that circumstantially, some of these, if not all of them, may be Chilean soldiers, as well as some of the camp followers who typically accompanied armies at that time, women, children, etc. Whatever it is, it appears to be a very rapid death event. All these are stratigraphically at the same level. Some of them were placed so close in their graves that they would have, if they were being dug over time, they would have dug through each other. And there's not a single case of one of these 55 disturbing any of the other 55. So something big happened at Chavin. And I just love the fact that there is no historic reference to anything happening in Chavin, which would account for the death of 55 people, mostly men of military age, mostly young women, mostly mothers, in some cases buried with a very young infant in the same grave. Fascinating, but Chavin is historic. There's much that's happened there. That event would have only been about 40 years in the past, if we're correct about what it dates to, when Teo started to take interest in Chavin in 1919. And I think I probably don't need to introduce Julio Teo to anyone. He was fascinated with Chavin as a doctor and archaeologist. He was looking for something on the old side that would bolster a claim for the Sierra to have been a very important part of the origins of civilization, if you will, in the Andes. Teo knocked around Chavin to some degree. There are pictures of him there. He helped clear parts of the site. Very little excavation per se was being done. It was mostly just massive clearing of post-Chavin deposits. But nonetheless, he and his disciples, who worked hard on documenting the site, and particularly the stone art that they found in it, made a huge first contribution. Other people were involved, including a Chavino named Marino Gonzalez, to whom we owe a debt of gratitude for conserving the site, chasing people out of it, keeping people from destroying it more than it already had been destroyed by stone robbing, looting, and other things. And while Marino Gonzalez was working there, John Rowe visited Chavin for 2 brief field seasons. And his field notes, which he generously gave to me, just handed them to me in a manila envelope. I was thunderstruck at his generosity. And his observations have a lot of relevance still today. Many of the things that he thought at that time, many derived from Marino Gonzalez's ideas, need to be at least somewhat corrected, but a great pioneer indeed. Luis Lumbreras follows closely in this time, contemporary of Marino Gonzalez as well. But Lumbreras by far is the person who has taken the best advantage of their fieldwork in order to circulate knowledge about Chavin. And I'm in great respect of this person. He's been like an advisor to me and a co-director in our program from time to time when he had the time and wasn't otherwise engaged. But his ideas have been a very strong influence on me. Richard Berger worked outside the monument itself in the surrounding areas and provided a great deal of information about Chavin, areas that nobody had really paid much attention to up to that time. And then historically, we sort of come next. There are a few other small projects, but they haven't contributed a great amount to what we know about Chavin. This is a chronogram of our originally project, and now by law, it must be a program to work in a World Heritage Site in Peru. You cannot do a project by which they're trying to say, we don't want to have little things happening in this site, we want big things. And so you rename it, call it a program, and you can get multi-year permissions and such. But whatever, I'm just trying to give a sense in Spanish, because I've never translated this one, of where the project came from starting in 1995, beginning with mapping, beginning with a few excavations which were just designed to verify certain aspects of the building sequence that the mapping had brought to our attention, eventually turning over to larger excavations. At that point, we realized that we had a responsibility to do conservation in this site. I mean, an immense responsibility to do that. We started working in areas around the site, and then after that, generally started moving over to focused excavations, working in the circular plaza and its immediate vicinity, working in the canal system of Chavin, which I'll get to, which is very different from the gallery system. And things like the historic burials, which really took quite a bit of time to deal with. And then a lot of what we're doing now has to do with excavations in near building C. As you'll see, they have a very different character than previous excavations we've done. And the subtle art of discovering new galleries has become a bit of a passion. Now, I want to run through personnel. And an individual with his hand inadvisedly raised is me. Beside me is my wife, Rosa. Rosa worked in Chavin before I did. She worked with Lumbreras over many of his field seasons, has been, obviously, as we are husband and wife, with me all years, all the field seasons as coordinator of the project and then program. But I have to say she's done most of the work that I wouldn't have wanted to do. Payroll, ordering things, making sure that everything's running smooth, which as the project turned to a program and got much bigger, was not always the easiest thing in the world. But I owe her a great debt of gratitude, and without her, I seriously doubt that I would be talking to you today about Chavin. Co-directors have involved Lumbreras and also Christian Messia, who you see here, who did his dissertation for his degree at Stanford by working in the site. Maria Mendoza here on the left runs our lab and has run our lab since it started to exist. An amazing person in terms of memory, tracking things, making sure everything gets cleaned, conserved, packaged, turned over, documented, cataloged, etc. She's a miraculous person. Beside her was our first resident archaeologist. Programs such as ours have to have a resident archaeologist with certain degree qualifications. And Augusto Bazan was our first and very, very capable resident archaeologist. Three very important people to the project today, and I'm not going to be able to cover everybody, to say the least, but people who have really meant a great deal to us within the last 10 years include, on the left, we have Miguel Ortiz. He is an archaeologist of incredible capabilities, field archaeologist, also analytical archaeologist, also incredible artist. And much of the art that you will see here today was drawn by Miguel, who has a degree in fine arts from Lima. He's just an unbelievable person in terms of his abilities. Liseth Rojas Palayo is in the center. She is our current resident archaeologist. Whereas Miguel came from San Marcos, she comes from Villarreal originally, but is finishing her master's degree in Católica. And she took up the tradition of competence that Augusto left behind and has not let that diminish in any form. An amazing person. And then we have Oscar Arias, who is one of our major excavators finishing his archaeology undergraduate program at San Marcos recently at highest honors, and is currently in a graduate program at Salamanca. And for any of you who are in the US looking at potential PhD applicants, if any of these three cross your table, take an awfully good look at them. They are wildly competent people. This is just an example of some of Miguel's art from the comic book. He hasn't lost the mystery of Chavin, shall we say. And then some notable people. I'm not going to have photos of everyone. Sylvia Kemble, who used some of the first reflectorless total station technology to map the galleries of Chavin, and wrote a dissertation which made the best sense out of the growth sequence of the site that anyone has to this day. And I would argue for the most part, she's overwhelmingly right. And if you haven't seen her dissertation, reserve a month, get it and read it. You'll need the full month, and I'm not joking. It is an incredible work. It's not difficult because it's not well written. It's difficult because she tackled an incredible level of complexity in 3 dimensions and across time. And it's just fantastic work. She's responsible for putting together a growth pattern for Chavin, which is very, very complex. At least 51 events are identified in her work. And that's hardly all of them. It's probably a minority, but she made a very great start. Melanie Ferraz here has become a specialist in our canal system. She's the person here on the left, and she's presented a work on some artifacts from one of the canal systems. She's very dedicated, having earned her PhD at the Sorbonne over the last few years, and continuing on to work with various collections we have. The one that she was reporting on here had to do with these so-called tupus, articulated bone pins and icons, which were found as a clear offering in a gallery. Miriam Kohler, an archaeoacoustician, taught us a whole lot about archaeoacoustics, especially in well-preserved spaces such as the galleries of Chavin. But her acoustics background and her PhD, the work that she did there allowed us to come to some pretty striking conclusions about the nature of sound in the galleries. In this case, this is just a graphic to remind me to say that she was able to show what I think is conclusively that some ducts leading from the internal galleries of Chavin to the outside areas were tuned to permit the passage of certain frequencies and not all of the others, allowing the sound, particularly of the Stromba's trumpet, that is played in the Lanzone gallery to reach the circular plaza, which is effectively an acoustically inexplicable phenomenon unless you are an acoustician. 2 people I don't have photographs for are Julio Bustamante and Enrique Cruciat, 2 engineering students at the Engineering University in Lima in the 70s, who began a study of the canal system of Chavin and have returned back to Chavin after they have completed their careers in hydraulic engineering to continue work, but now place this whole thing in time since we have a much better idea of the age of the different canals. Incredible colleagues. In addition to those people, we have people like Matt Sayer and Silvana Rosenfeld who are working typically across the river over in La Banda in some of the peripheral Chavin deposits. Dan Contreras, who has been our sort of geoarchaeological interface, and now with his expertise in dating, especially Bayesian modeling, has become one of our prime dating people. There are just a whole lot of people who worked at Chavin, and I cannot name them all, much less show their pictures. In addition, obviously, the people of Chavin have been a joy to work with. Many of the work people that we've had have worked for us for more than 20 years, and their competence, and many of those, in fact, worked for archaeologists, many archaeologists that worked in Chavin before us. So it's a very striking thing to have this type of a group of people that we can work with. We also have many young Peruvian archaeologists Peruvian archaeology students as well, and quite a number of Stanford students worked with me, along with a smattering of people from a totally rainbow of countries around the world. It's been a truly, truly amazing experience to work with them all. I really want to focus in on two people really quickly. They're young Chavinos. They're from Chavin. We have Alejandro Espinosa, and we have Freddy Melgarejo. They both now have their degrees from UNASAM, University in San Marcos, Huaraz, and are, I think, headed on to probably graduate degrees. And I'm more than thrilled, and particularly thrilled, that we were able to help them along by including them in our program, encouraging them. And I just think it's the most wonderful thing in the world that they have intention of continuing on in Chavin archaeology. And I'm really hoping that they do, and that they assume leadership positions within the program. Other people such as John Hurt and Julio Vargas Newman, who you see on the left, are some of the conservation people who have worked with us, trying to figure out the secrets of Chavin conservation. It's not an easy place to fix because of an earthquake that hit the site somewhere around 550 BC. The site was turned over to us in the present day, badly damaged. And that, as we reveal the site, has to be remedied at some level, or at the very least stabilized. I think in many ways, one of my greater roles has been to try to suggest that certain parts of the site should not be excavated in the foreseeable future because they will not be able to maintain themselves, short of some sort of very radical conservation that I'm not sure is in everyone's best interest. But Julio, particularly, has been our right-hand conservator, an expert in civil engineering and capable of reasoning through not only what it takes to keep Chavin physically alive today, but what did it take for the Chavinos of the past to figure out how to build in such a way that it had a fairly good chance of surviving. Then there's a group of engineering students, and I use this as proselytizing to suggest that if you're working in a site like this, here's one of the deep galleries, the Doble Mensula Gallery, these engineering students from Stanford served in a great role for us, mostly in contemplating exploration tasks and conservation tasks. We have two students here who are running a robot into a duct. It's a corded robot, as any robot really has to be going into these circumstances. But they were able to help us explore places where we couldn't reach, either because of the size of access or the question of limited stability in these spaces. But also we managed to place sensors. That thing with the headlights on it is not the sensor, but the little black box up and to its right is. They designed, built, tested, and set up sensors which would record temperature and humidity every 15 seconds for a year, ideally, before the memory would have to be dumped and the things restarted. Also, they've worked heavily on roofs and everything else. My experience is that you can't get engineers for any great length of time. Even our hydraulic engineers can spend a week with us, but they can't spend a field season with us, the obligations they have. But engineering, advanced undergraduates are some of the most creative and capable people that you might want to have in a monumental site. Here's just a sense of what our team looked like about 10 years ago. And this doesn't include any of the students at all. These were just the specialists working with us. don't expect you to read that or make any particular sense of it, but it has been a growing pattern in these years of project. Now, Chavin is a community. It's a complex community, but obviously in time period of community archaeology growing in importance, it's very important to relate to that community, especially one that so strongly identifies with this past. This was one of our first attempts to do a conservation workshop with the young people of Chavin. Third person from the left is Marino Gonzalez's daughter, and quite an honor to work with her. We've done a whole series of trainings in archaeology, conservation of pottery, conservation of lithics, and other things of the type. Probably not as much as we should have, but at least we've really tried to bring people in on a number of fronts, including conservation. We ran a project to try to crack a nut, and the nut is, how did Chavin make their polished blackware? It's a bit of a mystery because the polish on the polished blackware is generally not water resistant. Yet somehow in humid deposits it stayed on board, but it is fugitive. And so how do you polish something that well? How do you get it to gleam? How do you get it to be black, etc.? On the left, you can see a vessel from Lumbreras' excavations in Chavin. On the right, you can see a vessel that we managed to produce. And we think we're pretty close to reestablishing what the basic ceramic technology was for polished blackware at Chavin. Now, we didn't do that in a vacuum. We worked with local town artisans. Our great hope was, and still is to some degree, that high quality replicas, effectively almost museum, or in some cases museum quality, can be made and profitably made by people invested in that type of a craft work, rather than specializing in small keychain fobs in soft stone of tenon heads, which nobody makes a good living making at all. We've invested in the artisans and formed workshops and sent them all around Peru learning ceramic technologies. We've also encouraged them to learn how to carve shell and bone, which they do with a great deal of skill. That's been another way that we've managed to contribute to the community. We've worked with the school system, et cetera, et cetera. I don't have time to go into greater depth, but I just want to illustrate what I think is one of the more interesting interactions that we've had. And that was after we discovered a whole series of Strombus shell trumpets in 2001 in the gallery of Las Caracolas, we realized that the town had no tradition of Strombus trumpets at all. In fact, nobody even knew a word for them. And so we thought, well, let's try to wake up some interest and at least explain what these things are that we found that made a bit of a stir. And so before very long, I got a request from the people of La Banda to say, can you gift us a Strombus? Well, clearly couldn't do that with one of the archaeological ones, but I could, perusing through the craft shops of southern Peru, find a Strombus trumpet and gave it to them. And that began a whole series of events with Strombi, I guess, including their involvement in education. Here is Tito La Rosa playing for some school children. And now you will see the bullfight and various other things in Chavin are always begun with a serenade from Pututus. Pututu has come back, decidedly so. It's taken really quite as a Chavin symbol at this point. So whether that's good or bad, I think it's good, but I'm not crowing about it. I'm just saying we've had impact in the town, undoubtedly some negative, but I think a fair number of positive things have come about. Our comic book here being used in a classroom in Chavin comic that relates to what we think Chavin was all about, drawn by Miguel Ortiz and pretty widely distributed. We're hoping to translate it into English before too long and make it available on a broader basis. We have a whole series of institutions to thank. You can read them yourself. Our funding in recent years has come heavily from Antamina Mining Corporation, helped out by the Patronato Cultural de Peru, Global Heritage supported us for many years, etc. We're grateful to all of these institutions and sources of help. Certainly the Desconcentrada, the local affiliate of the Ministry of Culture in Huaraz, has always been helpful. And generally, there's been a long stream of archaeologists who administer the site of Chavin, without whom it would have been very difficult to work at the site. Okay, now it's time to get serious. I want to introduce you to time in a little bit more detail, but not too much. The most important thing here is just to recognize that there is a handle on the chronology of Chavin. We have somewhere in the range of 150 radiocarbon dates. We're about to run another 50. I feel quite confident in our radiocarbon chronology. Take that where you will. No one has anything that competes with it in terms of the context of the samples, the numbers, or the analysis that's been done on them. Now, we have an early and late Chavin time period defined. Within that, there are a bunch of phases, and time can be broken down in architecture in Chavin, even more fine level. But in many ways, the earlier part of this sequence, early Chavin, as I'll illustrate later, isn't well known. That's for good reasons I'll touch on. Late Chavin, I think we really know what we're talking about here. And we can pretty much terminate Chavin very close to 500 BC. It might go a couple decades after that. Chavin survives the earthquake, but not for very long. Coming close on its heels is what we call Huaraz. The Huaraz culture, part of the white on red horizon, if you will, what I call terminal formative. The difference between late Chavin and Huaraz could not be more marked. It's a sharp break in time. From our radiocarbon dating thus far, it cannot be taking more than maybe 20 years to happen. It's very fast and it's radical. The whole structure of the ceramic industry changes. There's nothing that looks the slightest Chavin in Huaraz, and there's nothing that looks the slightest Huaraz in Chavin. We're currently working on a project to figure out what that is. Who was it stayed in Chavin or came to Chavin? And how did this thing change so quickly? There's a bunch of hints, but we're going to some technical analyses that should answer that question pretty resoundingly. At any rate, so Chavin we can place between maybe as early as 1300 as a Chavin-like entity. There's much earlier archaeological remains in the area. And it changes over time, but not very much. Things such as galleries are present early in the construction sequence of Chavin. We wish we had a big ceramic sample to say whether Chavin traditions go back all the way to 1300. But as far back as we've been able to find any substantial amount of ceramic material, it doesn't look a whole lot different over time. It's pretty stable. It's all the more striking that it changes so radically with Huaraz. Now, I mentioned that early Chavin is not very well known. This rendition of Miguel's graphic of black and white phase Chavins aimed at depicting Chavin, say, around 700 to 550 BC calibrated. got a lot of red asterisks out there. These are places where we have, for various reasons, excavated deeply enough. Usually they're places where there is no significant chavine construction or chavine formal floors, which I'm generally not willing to dig through. But we manage in these places to get quite deep. And at each one of these locations, what we can say is the architecture of chavine was wildly different than what you see here. So this is sort of a scary perspective because we like to think that we've covered chavine architecture in various growth patterns through Kemble's work and other work we've done. And it often involves significant segments of the architecture you see here today. But yet we're finding architecture which is not in a pattern coherent with this architecture, lying many, many meters below the current chavine. A takeaway lesson is that chavine buildings, the platform, truncated pyramids, or whatever you want to call them, are not built on ground surface. They're built on a construction sequence below them and have many, many meters to go until you reach sterile sediments. So there's a whole lot left to investigate in late chavine, but early chavine, we hardly know what we're doing. It's going to be fascinating. I hope to be around to see some of that happen. Now, I'd like to turn over to thinking about environment. The term that I would use here, and it'll, I'm sure, raise all sorts of hackles, is geocultural co-determinism. And I'm not trying to say that what happened at chavine was determined by the environment, but I think a lot of things going on in the environment influenced chavine heavily, and there is, in my mind, no doubt that chavine influenced the environment palpably. So how does this come about? Well, one of the things that's very interesting about chavine is that the construction is made out of these large structures, a very well organized internal core of what we call nuclear architecture, layers of stones laid in a very strong gravelly mortar, with facades placed on the sides of the buildings, the upper parts frequently in cut stone. People, myself included, have often assumed, well, you have the walls and you have the fill in the middle. And the fill is what you put inside the walls because you're not going to have a big old hole there. It just couldn't be more wrong for chavine. The facades are probably relatively transitory. They can be peeled off by earthquakes and such and put back up. But as long as you've got a core of highly organized and very stable fill, really a nucleus, you've got a very different situation. And you can just put your facades back up around that nuclear fill, should they fall down. Or you can take them down and rebuild them, which we think chavine did a number of times. But that's very susceptible to water damage. In other words, you've got a nuclear fill that has a mortar. That mortar is by and large not fired. And therefore, if you start introducing a lot of water in there, you're going to degrade the clays in the mortars and you start to get serious instability. Chavine's in a rainy environment. What are you going to do? Well, you obviously need drainage. And the chavine had an extensive drainage canal system. Mostly what we know about is that it runs underground. So I always thought, well, they ran the water off the side of the buildings and then into the canals and off to the rivers, which is where the canals go. Well, that doesn't turn out to be the case. Most of the canals are fed by two major mechanisms. One is drainage, as you can see here. Water running across the top of the building, not to the facade where it would have run down and stripped clays from the mortar joining the stones, or at least degrading it. But rather you run it in towards the center of the building, drop it down chimneys, and then run it out laterally to the rivers. An amazing way of looking at this, getting this done. The other thing that we've come into recently is that the canal system itself has tended to filter. These are filtration canals, which can accept water through their walls. And so water can come into it in a flow from some sort of a channeled source, or it can also filter in from the sediments on either side of the canal. We've seen it happen. It's a very strong process, which we've never expected to see before. So maintaining the canal system is obviously an extremely important part of things. I show a gallery in cross-section in this drawing, and you can see the ducts coming in and out of that gallery. Well, that's, everybody says, well, these are ventilators to bring in oxygen so that your Chavin participants in cult activities or other types of things don't pass out. Well, maybe. What we can say, using those humidity and temperature detectors that our engineering students made, is that it makes all the difference in the world in terms of humidity if you've got air passing through your structure. So you also filter water in effect. You evaporate water from the surface of the galleries. Sometimes it will run into the gallery, but if you've got air passing through, you're going to strip that humidity out. A very fascinating way of getting at keeping a building not dry. Last thing you want is these things to dry out, but at a relatively constant percentage humidity. Working with Julio Vargas, we came up with this sort of idea. So it's been a lot of fun to get somewhere with that. The canal system itself is one heck of a creation. Here you can see some of the manipulation of water, which was done in one canal system in the North Esplanade area. And we have canals crossing over each other, turning around each other, dumping in, doing all sorts of, in many cases, not very necessary things. We've come up with the idea that the canal system pretty intentionally replicates the meeting of the two rivers where Chavin is located. One, a more inclined high energy river, and one, a low angle river, in order to conduct the water away, but in a very specific pattern in which you always have the high angle canal coming in from the same side. The Wachexa River comes in to the Mosna River. We've seen enough of this now that I don't think it's by chance. So Chavin was aware of environmental parameters beyond a doubt, and they responded in various ways. Now, the canal system was used quite often for sacrificial purposes. We have some very good evidence now for this, what you see here, ceramic sacrifice into canals going on. We found vessels in pretty much complete situation, only just minor fractures that were the last ones thrown into a canal before it was sealed and no longer conducted water. So they're a sacrificial location beyond a doubt. They were probably a dumping location as well. But canals are a very large part of Chavin engineering. Sacrifice is meant to be a transition into the idea of sacrifice, is something that we can now document in many Chavin contexts. It isn't offering as much as it is sacrifice, because what is being offered is destroyed, inalterably destroyed, smashed. And they're smashing obsidian. well, I wouldn't recommend it too much, but they're abusing obsidian in amazing ways. And it's meant to take that down to a very small scale and eliminate its value. This particular setting that you see, which is one of the entranceways, the original entranceways in Chavin, shows an amazing amount of smashed material that's been reduced way down. And that includes this range of stuff. And yes, that's jade. So colorful, presumably rather valuable, and its value is being eliminated systematically. Presumably an offering indeed, but a terminal offering being made as some sort of a dedication to the site. Now, in terms of the environment, Dan Contreras's work and some of my own deductions about this area have shown that it's a very dangerous area indeed. It's a lot of risk going on here. And these white arrows just depict some of the larger risk, including something like the alluvion of 1945 that came down the Wachexa drainage, the thin arrow heading towards us, the hill slopes slipping away, mass wasting towards the monument itself, which the monument grows towards, not away from. And then a controversial issue of whether the river was moved by the Chavin people. I continue to think that it is. Dan Contreras's excavations showed river sediments in the right places. Our hydraulic engineers beg to differ on at least part of that observation. But Chavin was clearly in the act of altering the environment in many ways, trying to keep itself secure. I can't tell you whether the rockfall that occurred in Chavin on June 30th of the past year, which dropped untold hundreds, thousands or more tons of rock into the town of Chavin, whether that had anything to do with a change in habits that might have destabilized that rock face. Luckily, no one was killed and no one was even injured because of the time of day and some early warning signs that were picked up. But this is a very dangerous location. And the risk involved in building here was clearly compensated by certain human actions. And I think it clearly involves human concept of the importance of being able to probably challenge nature. Okay, I realize that, of course, I'm wordy as usual. So what I would like to do is very quickly run through some information on galleries, because here's where I'd like to get at some ideas about Chavin, the way Chavin thought about Chavin, and I'll try to do it very fast. There are about 36 known gallery systems in Chavin, so Chavin is characterized by these. They're very different in their form and have proved, in the few cases where there are preserved remains, they've proved to have radically different contents. And I should also say contents or not, because we've dug some undisturbed galleries with no contents whatsoever. So what are these about? How do we think about this very important gallery system? Well, our first work, of course, was in the Caracoles Gallery, the Circular Plaza area. See that here on the left hand of the two labeled galleries. Those trumpets were engraved, 20 of them still playable in very good condition, suggesting a sacristy-like function, place of storage of ritual things. Since the time of that excavation, and that excavation is represented here by this particular blue asterisk, if you can see my pointer, we have managed to discover galleries at all of the locations that are marked with blue asterisks, and we strongly presuppose that we've got them as well in the locations of the yellow asterisks. And we don't begin to think we've found all of them, even in these particular areas. So we've figured out pretty easily how to discover galleries. Getting at them in some cases is considerably more difficult. In the case of Caracoles, we have 4 galleries lined up, adding to the number of galleries in the atrium of the circular plaza. There seem to be 4 more here immediately north of these 4, filling in most of this space. We have reason to believe that there are probably galleries saturating almost all of the atrium area around the circular plaza. These galleries were planned into a building growth 2.5 meters high, which is just the height of elevation of a building you need to do to build a gallery into it. Now, this begins to make us think that galleries are not only common, but they're part of the formulation of the architecture. And in the case of this single building event of the atrium of the circular plaza, they were laid out in everything but overlapping fashion. But yet they're very different shaped galleries. And as I mentioned, very different contents. Here you can see that gallery system. Ofrendas, where Limburus found a very large offering. Campamento here, which was excavated, but unfortunately we know almost nothing about the contents. They probably no longer are with us. And then the 4 or 8 galleries of the Caracoles series. So you can see planning, there is some symmetry. We tend to look at it around this axis here coming in, but it's not properly looked at in that light. The true axis of symmetry for these galleries is running north-south, not east-west. That's probably respecting the early entrance to building A, which is right here, which comes out between these pairs of galleries. So there is actually quite a bit of information in where the galleries are from. This is only to show you some pottery analysis from the galleries in the atrium area. They show great variability in the forms of pottery found in the different galleries. Chi-square and other such tests show that we're way off of any possibility of these differences being by chance. So that involves both the forms and the decorative techniques. Similarly, the contents of the gallery, other contents, are highly differentiated between the galleries, and each one of the 4 completely excavated Caracoles series galleries has a long history. Starting in the black and white phase, they seem to crank up, I'm quite sure they crank up right about 850 BC, calibrated. And by 550 BC for the earthquake, they are going to be shut down. And in fact, earthquake materials, fallen walls and such, are actually thrown into the galleries through their very small entrances. Past this. In the case of our current work over in the North Esplanade, we've been trying to look at the galleries and how they grew in relation to the architectural growth in this area. We have one gallery that looks like this, very early, built down using walls of prior buildings on the Esplanade. This is the North Esplanade. It's not within one of the plaza basins of Chile, but to the outside of that. Shortly after this stage, this early stage in building C's construction, those walls that you see down low were incorporated into this structure, the gallery of the Esplanade. Excavated in excavation looks like this. And now you can see where it lies. And at the same time, small buildings are built on top of building C with exceptionally thick stone walls. as independent freestanding structures. Those are gradually incorporated into a gallery system as the site is raised in height 2.5 meters. And in the act of doing so, they managed to eventually overwhelm earlier galleries, which lay out here to this side of that complex of galleries in the earlier stage here. But those galleries are overwhelmed by these galleries, but many of them take the same form. They have a set of walls which have been de-roofed, and then a new set of walls built above, the lower ones filled in, very well filled in, and a similar but new version of what was underlying was built. So this seems to be a strong pattern in Chavin. I'm going to wind up my description here with this final thing coming from this year, where A is here. This is a duct leading into a gallery in building D. This is building C here. That's worth building D. When we have a duct coming out, especially in an earlier facade, notice this is one of the few cases in Chavin with clear sequences of facades. That duct, we can be pretty sure is going to lead into a gallery. And in our field season this year, we managed to get in through the duct. Not a pleasant experience, I can testify to. But when we got inside, we realized we're into a gallery which was sealed very unusually well before the termination of Chavin. And that almost all the galleries were kept alive, if you will. Their entrances were extended as lateral growth occurred. Their entrances were raised as vertical growth occurred. But in this case, they didn't do that. So we have a gallery which still has a history to it. And here we're looking as the first picture I took in that gallery after I emerged out from the duct. And in front of me is a stone vessel with a condor head and neck and curving down. It's very clear. Wings are engraved on the side. A tail is engraved on the far side. It's sitting on top of termination deposits. It's not on the floor at all. And the gallery, that's the condor. You see that the condor's beak, unfortunately, was sheared off, and then the surface rounded back to a fairly attractive rounded surface in an attempt to sort of disguise that it lost its beak. But nonetheless, this is the form of that gallery. It has a lot of explanation that's needed. We've only excavated uppermost fill deposits, in part because we need to get in through the original entranceway. But one of the most fascinating characteristics of this gallery is that it has a bench all the way around what was originally, about 2 stages before it was sealed, the room of the primary room of the gallery. And because in one of the later stages, they reworked one of the walls, we can see that they're very thick walls. They're somewhere not quite 1 meter thick, but pretty close. And that's just not usual for gallery situations unless we're talking about prior surface structures. This bench around small rectangular room is very, very suggestive. I've never seen this in a Chavin gallery before. I'm not surprised if it did happen in some other ones, especially those that have surface rooms, which were later incorporated into a gallery system. This one, we've still got the benches. The ceiling, it's corbelled. Yeah. Say, well, those are just mensulas. No, they're not. This is true corbelling. So it's a very different gallery. It seems to be reflecting something quite different and undoubtedly older given its very low position in building D. So we think we've got a new old gallery. The floor deposits may give us some evidence of what that really is about and what they were doing with that space. But I'd like to conclude with some observations on this stuff. And I originally planned to show you much more, but of course, originally I didn't plan to be this long-winded. The main thing that I'd like to try to get here is the idea of time transgression. Why galleries? What was the point of galleries? Why do you build this underground space? What's it worth? How does that tell us anything about Chavin? Well, the most important thing is that use of galleries to access spaces of much greater antiquity, well, of antiquity at the time these buildings were being grown, is a way of accessing the past. It's how you go back in time. And if you take the Lanzone Gallery, you take this new Gallery of the Condor, you take the Loco Gallery system, and you take the Caracola series, they all incorporate walls which were surface walls prior to the building of the first phase of the gallery. I don't think this is trivial. It would have been easy to dismantle those original walls and build with your free will whatever you chose. But they didn't. They kept those, and quite often it is those original walls that are in some of the areas that are most respected in terms of contents, in terms of entranceways coming in towards them. They are really the center areas of the galleries. So Chavin is very interested in its past. We've been able to see this again in the North Esplanade excavations, where we have excavated roughly an area about 20 by 30 meters in size. It's our largest area excavation. And we've been able to document a huge amount of smaller scale architecture built outside of the central basins, if you will, of the plazas, outside of the buildings rather than inside them within the U-shaped definitions. And they are, beyond a doubt, within these sequences, very intense sequences of building and rebuilding surface architecture, not always burying it. They are frequently and consistently either digging holes down to a prior structure and reclosing those, or more commonly, they're probably digging smaller holes, or maybe at the time they're building upwards, they're putting in stone-lined pits, really just little vertical shafts that go down and end on the earlier structure. And in some cases, those take the form of the earlier structure. The pits are, you have one case where there's somewhere between 80 and 100 pits defining the shape of the earlier structure, a shape that's been lost in the later structure, but it's still being remembered, if you will. It's still being observed. So it's not really remembering, it's noting. It's saying, here there was. It's a tombstone. It's a way of knowing what happened in the past. Why? I think it's very simple. Chavin is in the act of changing its world, along with many of the other formative centers. They're doing things that haven't been done before. How do you legitimize that? How can you make people think that you're worth this new structure, this new social political structure is worth investing in? Because they're radical and really different? Oh, sure. I think in the formative time, especially the earlier formative times, earlier and radical would have been swept out so fast. So I think you mark the past, you make the past accessible, you keep the past alive, you legitimize the present. So I think we're seeing Chavin's very effective use of the past. In a few cases, I think we've seen Chavin marking the future. But I'll leave that for a future talk so that everyone can either go to sleep or get dinner. But I think there's a time consciousness in Chavin, which is very suggestive that these organizations know where they are in time. They know what came before. They're making some arguments that I don't think are right. I think they're trying to make people think that they're just doing a new version of the previous thing. But I don't think that's really true. There's a certain level of deception going on in just about everything in Chavin. Of that, I'm quite confident. But what's most interesting with these little tunnels back in time is that some of them were in positions that never would have been seen by somebody just casually visiting or even being initiated into the cult of Chavin, which makes me think that the belief isn't shallow. This isn't a belief system, a cult, or series of cults that are designed to deceive and nothing more. Looks like there are true believers involved, and that maybe deception isn't quite the right word, maybe more along the lines of artifice. But at any rate, Chavin is walking some very interesting paths, keeping as best they can confidence from their surrounding populations, and particularly secondary elite in their own system and elites from further away. That's how Chavin built. That's how Chavin extended itself far beyond where one might have expected it to, based on largely a ritually run system. Thank you very much, and I hope that this has been entertaining. I'm happy to answer questions, but I do appreciate the fact that I'm rather on the overtime side. Thank you.